Shakespeare looms large in the English language canon. He wrote plays and poetry, and even if you haven't read his work, you'll probably have at least heard a passing familiarity with stories like, Romeo and Juliet, or Hamlet, or Othello. You've probably seen The Lion King, Hamlet, Nomeo and Juliet, kids' version of Romeo and Juliet. These three are classified as tragedies, though Shakespeare also wrote comedies like Much Ado About Nothing or As You Like It. 10 Things I Hate About You, which is, early 2000s, is The Taming of the Shrew. And he also wrote histories as well, like Henry V. The play that will be read this term is classified as a tragic comedy, so it's sort of between categories, and that play, of course, is The Tempest. It's impossible to know for sure, but some scholars identify The Tempest as Shakespeare's final play. Now, whether that brings it special significance or what that significance would be is up for debate, but I think that you'll be able to see which elements in this play raise those kinds of questions. For instance, there's a long speech at the end, but whether it's actually the last one or not, we know it was written close to the end of his life, sometime between 1608 and 1611, and that he died 5 years later in 1616. And we also know that this play was written during the period of British colonial expansion and that it draws from actual events related to what was then called the New World. This period of early colonial expansion meant that people in Europe had an unprecedented exposure to outside cultures and beliefs and customs, though of course this is all filtered through things like travel writing, and that coincides with two other exciting developments. Here we're going to draw on the writings from Shakespearean scholars Barbara Moet and Paul Wernstein. First, we have the development in literature. This applies to the entire period when Shakespeare was writing. Moet and Wernstein explained that around this time, people are exposed to Greek and Roman classics for the first time. Those works were translated and distributed in print, so people were introduced to these beliefs and worldviews outside of Christian texts that they were used to. These beliefs were not just outside, but they were even in conflict with those Christian texts. So this drives an intense period in the arts when people are questioning and exploring and playing, and all of this is reflected in Shakespeare's works. The second development is in astronomy. Copernicus said back in the 1540s that the Earth was not at the center of the universe, which was controversial to say the least. And in 1609, Galileo creates his telescope. So right in that window of that last big push in Shakespeare's output, Galileo's telescope confirms that Copernicus was right. Now people go from having the set idea about there being a certain order and organization in the universe, and that idea gets entirely disrupted. Imagine how much that would shake people's beliefs. Imagine how well they handled that. Ultimately, this upheaval is the context for the era that Shakespeare inhabits. Something else to keep in mind about his audience is that Shakespeare's plays are performed at his theater, the Globe, but they're also performed at court. So he's writing for a pretty broad appeal across social class, and he would be navigating a range of belief within his society. Getting into The Tempest, in particular, another figure to be aware of is Michel de Montaigne. I'm going to say it wrong, and in a variety of versions. I've listened to it online a few times to try to get the pronunciation right, and I'm not pulling it off. He's a French philosopher and writer who overlapped with Shakespeare by about a few decades, and Shakespeare references a famous essay of his in The Tempest. It's titled Of Cannibals. And in it, Montaigne addresses the idea of people from the New World as being labeled uncivilized. He writes about a specific ethnic group in Brazil, and his view is that they are no less civilized than Europeans, and he goes on to explain that they seem to be even better than Europeans because they have what Montaigne calls a pure way of life. He argues that whatever is closest to nature is best. We've got a long quote here, so my apologies, but here comes a wall of words Montaigne states. I just listened to it, so that's closest. I find that there is nothing barbarous and savage in this nation by anything that I can gather, excepting that everyone gives the title of barbarism to everything that is not in use in his own country, as indeed we have no other level of truth and reason than the example and idea of the opinions and customs of the place wherein we live. There is always the perfect religion, there the perfect government, and there the most exact and accomplished usage of all things. Do you see some similarities to what Montagnans say here in what we've seen from Frantz Fanon and Edward Said? Getting back to Shakespeare in The Tempest, he'll put some of those words in the mouth of a character named Gonzalo. So look for the part where Gonzalo explains what sort of colony he would establish on the island. I mentioned earlier that the play draws from then current events. So the story of The Tempest seems to have been inspired by the wreck of a real ship called the Sea Venture that was part of a fleet carrying settlers and new government officials to the Jamestown colony in 1609. The fleet hit a massive storm near Bermuda, and the Sea Venture was believed to be lost. But in actuality, the passengers and crew of the Sea Venture managed to survive for a year on an uninhabited island before they eventually made it to Jamestown in 1610. To get into some of the nuts and bolts of the characters, we have two sets of brothers who are all noblemen. First is Prospero and Antonio, and then Alonso and Sebastian. Prospero is the Duke of Milan, but his brother Antonio stole his dukedom with the help of Alonso, and that's why Prospero is living on an island. He fled on a ship with his daughter, and he is stranded there. Alonso is the king of Naples, and his brother Sebastian wants to steal his kingdom with the help of Antonio, who is Prospero's brother. So basically, we have a web of brothers conspiring against each other. Miranda is Prospero's daughter, and Ferdinand is Alonso's son. Ferdinand is the heir to the throne of Naples, and because of this, Prospero encourages a romance between Ferdinand and Miranda. This romance progresses pretty quickly, considering all of the action of the play takes place in like 3 hours. Now we also have Caliban. Note that his name is very close to the word cannibal, which is significant because of the connection to the Of Cannibals essay by Michel du Montaigne, and Caliban was born on the island after his pregnant mother Sycorax was exiled there. So he is there before Prospero shows up, and the audience learns that the relationship between Prospero and Caliban began somewhat positively and cooperatively, but Prospero has since enslaved Caliban after he tried to rape Miranda. Caliban is seen as subhuman, and he's referred to as a monster by many of the characters. We have another character, this is Ariel, who's a spirit that is also controlled by Prospero. One thing that makes Shakespeare challenging to read is that plays aren't meant to just be read from the page. The intended mode of delivery is a live performance. So when you're just reading the play off the page, try to imagine all of the action happening on stage, not on an island or a ship, but on the stage. Pay attention to the stage direction and try to imagine the physicality of the performance. I also recommend reading summaries of each act before you get into the real thing, so it's easier to kind of follow the action. For this week, you only need to read the first 2 acts of the play, and like with Gilgamesh, it should go fairly quickly once you get into the rhythm of the story. Some questions you might want to consider and keep in mind as you read. What seems to be motivating Prospero in how he approaches the island? How do post-colonial themes like race and class and oppression emerge in the story so far? What's the connection between knowledge and power? And do people with power have the knowledge, or do the people with the knowledge have the power? Basically, how do those two work in tandem? I hope you enjoy your foray into Shakespeare, and we look forward to stepping into next week as well when we get into it further. Thank you again to Karen Kaiser for the information for this video.